Thank you so much, and thank you all for such a nice introduction. I'm so pleased to be here with you this afternoon to talk about our beloved Balboa Park and the people who, over the years, have taken such pains to promote and preserve this very special space. We have recently learned a great deal about the history of international exhibitions. Their history stretches back to 1851, when Queen Victoria and Prince Albert sponsored the Great Exposition as a way to celebrate the products of England's Industrial Revolution and to promote free trade. And exhibits were housed in what was called the Crystal Palace, a purpose-built glass and iron structure located in London's Hyde Park. Visitors came from all over the world, from Belgium to Borneo, along with 1/3 of England's population, or about 6 million people. The success of the Great Exhibition gave rise to an international exhibition industry that spread across the globe. There were shows in Paris, Amsterdam, and Barcelona, in Australia, New Zealand, and Tasmania. In the United States, World's Fairs were held in Louisville, New Orleans, Philadelphia, Nashville, and Atlanta before the turn of the 20th century. And they continue today with upcoming exhibitions in Kazakhstan next year and the United Arab Emirates in 2020. Now, it won't surprise you to learn that men organized and designed nearly all of the great exhibitions of the Victorian era. The 19th century was an age in which men had a monopoly on political power, wealth, and influence. This changed in 1890 when a group of enterprising Chicago women lobbied Congress for an active leadership role in what would mark the 400th anniversary of Columbus's discovery of America. And the result was a congressional act that required the creation of a board of lady managers, not only for Chicago, but for every subsequent exposition that received federal funding. And this is Bertha Potter Palmer who got things started. She was a very well-connected socialite in Chicago. She summed up the importance of federal recognition. She said, "Even more important than the discovery of Columbus," she said, "is the fact that the general government has just discovered women." Federal funding meant that women would play important roles in almost all of the great World's Fairs that flourished in the United States between 1890 and 1915. The lady managers built a women's building in Chicago designed by Sophia Hayden, an MIT graduate and one of only 3 female architects in the country. Subsequent fairs in Atlanta, Buffalo, St. Louis, and Seattle also had space for women. In San Francisco, meanwhile, the Women's Board had been founded and was tasked with furnishing and maintaining the California Host Building. Now, you might be surprised to hear that the early directors of San Diego's Panama-California Exposition Company failed to acknowledge women's potential for service, much less allocate them space in the park. Our exhibition was built quickly, with limited funds and considerable doubts about its success. In 1909, the directors scrambled to keep up with San Francisco boosters, who were well on their way towards creating a competing World's Fair. They lacked the congressional support, and there was no guarantee that government-sponsored museums, such as the U.S. Post Office or the U.S. Mint, would be able to send exhibits to San Diego. Without federal funding or recognition, the directors saw no reason to involve women, in other words, to create a board of lady managers. They also wanted to avoid continued conflict over the issue of alcohol consumption at the fair. Many local organizations, including the Women's Temperance Union, campaigned vigorously for prohibition. They believed that alcohol consumption, particularly among the working classes, caused serious social problems such as crime, poverty, and prostitution. And those who had attended the Seattle Exposition in 1909 knew that Prohibition could be successful. Seattle was a dry fair. Prominent citizens like George Marston, religious and fraternal organizations, the Anti-Saloon League, they all pressed for a dry exhibition here in San Diego. This did not happen largely because the organizers were very keen to make sure that this exhibition made a profit, right? And without the ability to sell wine or beer in restaurants, or to even allow people a little tipple, there was really very little chance that many people were going to show up. Most people probably would just head to San Francisco, right? And they'd have a local audience only. So what had happened is that in 1913, the directors decided that they would allow alcohol at the fair. They'd allow beer and wine in restaurants, and even free samples of bourbon and whiskey to authorized vendors. So it was women's organizations, and particularly clubs, that led the charge for women's participation in the World's Fair. In October 1913, the San Diego Federation of Women's Clubs sent a resolution to the directors of the exposition asking to be recognized and to be given a chance to cooperate. The board tried to placate them by offering Rosa Davidson, who was at that time the wife of the exposition's president, offering her the role of director of social amenities, but they gave her no defined role. They also allowed limited space to the Daughters of the American Revolution and the YWCA. But that was not enough. In 1914, less than a year before the fair was due to open, a group of San Diego women gathered to discuss the situation at the U.S. Grant Hotel. And they formed the San Diego Women's Association for the purpose. Now this is 47-year-old Evelyn Lawson, who was the newly elected president of the Wednesday Club. She was a woman with keen literary interests and very good connections. She was married to the Yale University-educated brother of Victor Fremont Lawson, owner and publisher of the Chicago Daily News, and he was also president of the Associated Press. She was described as a woman of extraordinary tact and presumably political skills. Another advocate was Carrie Gertrude Gilbert, president of the Amphion Club. She and her sister, and I think this is a much nicer picture of Carrie Gilbert than the one that you guys have been using. But she and her sister hosted many famous musicians and composers in their Bankers Hill home. There was also Alice Klauber, a well-known artist and clubwoman, whose brother-in-law, Julius Wangenheim, sat on the exposition board. Now, their object was to secure $75,000 that remained in the hands of San Diego's Board of Supervisors. Alice Klauber told a local newspaper, "The women of San Diego feel that they should be represented at the exposition." And she said they were going to be prepared to fight. She said, "If proper provision is not made for women during 1915, we will advertise that fact in every women's club in the United States," right? And remember, Evelyn Lawson, right, her brother-in-law is head of the Associated Press. She certainly can get that tidbit of news nationwide. San Diego newspapers, of course, loved the drama. The Union described it here as the Exposition Teapot Tempest, writing that the women would plant a big fight if they were denied recognition. Now realize at this moment, this is 1914, the exposition directors are really well aware of women's capacity for political action. In 1911, California women had won the vote after a hard-fought campaign. British women, meanwhile, were still fighting for their rights. In June of 1914, San Diego's newspapers covered the civil disobedience campaign waged by suffragists in England. Emmeline Pankhurst, you can see it at the top left, was pictured in the San Diego Sun above the caption, "Mrs. Pankhurst arrested at Palace Gate, screams message to King." The conservative San Diego Union, meanwhile, reported, "Militants defy law, Britain's bordering on panic," right? So this is the context, right? 1914. So in the end, the exposition board relented and agreed to provide space and official representation to San Diego women. At a June 1914 meetings, the executive committee appointed a women's board, agreed to provide them rooms at the fair to be used for entertainment purposes, but they did not give them a women's building of their own. At this very late date, right, June of 1914, that was deemed both impractical and expensive. So what they did is they set aside rooms on the second floor of the California building and granted them $5,000 for furnishing. So they didn't get all the $75,000 that they wanted from the Board of Supervisors. They just had to be happy with the $5,000 they got. But the Women's Board included some of the most progressive, intelligent, and artistic women in San Diego. The majority belonged to the Wednesday Club, a group that believed that aesthetic enterprises, in particular the study of art and literature, could transform both the individual and society. Their arts and crafts philosophy harmonized with their clubhouse, designed by Hazel Waterman, and located only a short distance from Balboa Park. History has left us only fragments of information about these women. Ella Foote, for example, contributed a column called Arts and Artists for the San Diego Union. Her daughter described her as a remarkable woman with an immense intellectual curiosity. Alice Klauber, a well-known artist, meanwhile, was one of the moderns who promoted avant-garde art from an early date. According to one contemporary, she lived in the rhythm of the artistic. Topics discussed at Wednesday Club meetings included post-impressionism, modern drama, new music, and 20th century poetry. The headquarters of the Women's Board were located on the second floor of the California building, a highly ornate Spanish colonial-style structure, which you all know about today, that this was the building that welcomed visitors to the fair. And inside were exhibits focused on the ancient Maya, Inca, and Aztec civilizations. The Women's Board chose to complement these exhibits with a decorative scheme that reflected the cultures of the Pacific Rim. Klauber and her committee transformed a long, bare room and gallery into an artistic space filled with Navajo rugs, black lacquered wicker furniture, and a curtain taken from a Chinese theater in Canton. The color scheme, at that time described as daring, consisted of persimmon red and black with an undercurrent of soft brown. On the walls hung paintings by Donald Beauregard, a modernist artist whose works were filled with vigorous brushwork and brilliant color. And his works are now in the Santa Fe Museum of Art. Klauber defended these works from critics of the new art by equating their freedom and innovation with her arts and crafts decorative scheme. She later wrote, "What the pictures did for that room cannot be exaggerated. For 2 years they sang across the spaces of a rather cold interior and made it vibrate with clear, fine tones. Persons who had arrived at the doorway to see this colorful interior drew audible breaths of relief." The Hostess Gallery provided a space where women could sit, rest, and enjoy a little solitude before diving back into the hurly-burly of the fair. They stood in marked contrast to other areas, most notably the Isthmus, or amusement zone, where women's activities were often commodified and sexualized. The Isthmus included a model Chinatown with an underground opium den and quote-unquote slave girls, a Hawaiian village with hula dancers, and a 49ers mining camp that recreated the lawless atmosphere of the gold rush. And it was there patrons could get, quote, something a little stronger than water and flirt with, quote-unquote, ladies. Restrooms were also offered by other women's organizations. The WCTU provided tea in a seating area in the Commerce and Industries building, and here the walls were decorated with newspaper clippings, posters, and flyers about the temperance movement. Other tea rooms were maintained by the YWCA, the Daughters of the American Revolution, and the San Diego Women's Press Club. A novel feature of the exhibit was a day nursery or a creche organized by the Women's Board. At that time, there were very few care facilities for young children, and in fact, the kindergarten movement was still in its infancy. Anne Seabury, who was the head of the Children's Committee, arranged for a portable house to be placed at the back of the California building. And for a modest fee, women could leave their children for a half day or a whole day while they toured the grounds. And the local newspaper crowed that even San Francisco could not compete with the largest baby checking establishment on the Pacific coast. The Fine Arts Committee, meanwhile, established a modern art exhibit in the Fine Arts Building. Alice Klauber, chair of the committee, worked with artists Robert Henry and Edgar Hewitt to develop the show. A painter herself, Klauber had studied with Henry in Spain, and convinced that San Diego welcomed new ideas, the artist invited his East Coast friends, many of them who were realists, who were part of the New York's Ashcan School, to join him in establishing a cutting-edge exhibit. Patrons ultimately didn't purchase many of these pictures, and the artists were very sad about that. It was a little too cutting edge for San Diego, but many people walked home with copies of the exhibition catalog, which was published under the auspices of the Women's Board. The Art Committee also organized a series of modern art exhibits in the Little Gallery of the Fine Arts Building that include modernist pastels by female artists Ruth Townsend and Alice Anderson. And in November, Klauber hung some of her own oil paintings, including this one, the California Tower. Klauber, along with her brother-in-law Julius Wangenheim, banker, also play an important role in the establishment of a permanent home for art, the Fine Arts Gallery of San Diego, and which is now, of course, the San Diego Museum of Art. And so that idea of having a San Diego Museum of Art got started at the time of the Exposition in 1915. The Women's Board was also responsible for bringing internationally recognized performers to the exhibition. Gertrude Gilbert, chair of the Music Committee, drew on the resources of the Amphion Club, an organization that became a powerful force in the development of the San Diego music scene. A talented pianist, Gilbert had an exceptional mind, said contemporaries, very fast-thinking and far-seeing, and people would, quote, listen to her and get things done. She was able to promise financial support and an appreciative audience for musical stars such as Helen Beach Yaw, who was known as the California Nightingale, and she also brought out Madame Ernestine Schumann-Heink, the celebrated operatic contralto. Both of these women were recording artists for the Victor Talking Machine Company, and as a result had become international celebrities, known throughout the world. Popular composer Carrie Jacobs Bond also appeared at the exposition, and she had sold 1 million copies of the parlor song, I Love You Truly. And I know there's people here who must know that song. I love you truly, dearly I do. Yes, you do. Now, like their counterparts in San Francisco, the Women's Board also entertained visiting dignitaries, most notably former President Theodore Roosevelt, who attended a reception at the women's headquarters shortly after his arrival. They hosted a banquet in honor of Eleanor McAdoo, the daughter of President Woodrow Wilson, who represented her father for the exposition opening. Other famous guests included Russian ballerina Anna Pavlova, who performed at the Spreckles Theater, and Mount Holyoke President Mary E. Woolley, who was known to be the youngest college president of the oldest women's college. The Women's Board continued their work through 1916 after the exposition was extended for a second year. Visitors continued to praise the hostess gallery and ask about how they could acquire arts and crafts furnishings. Evelyn Lawson noted, the inference appeared to be that to many classes of visitors, San Diego was furnishing fresh and vivid ideas as well as picturesque memories. When the exhibition finally closed, the Women's Board congratulated themselves on having performed heroic service for the city of San Diego. Seabury praised the businesslike way in which women went to work, their skill at organizing committees, and their frugality at a time when most men thought all women were spenders. In the Fine Arts Building, they introduced the 20th century point of view espoused by avant-garde artists, while in the California Building, they presented opportunities for women to explore and share progressive ideas about child welfare, labor relations, and the domestic arts. 20 years later, at the close of the 1935 California Pacific International Exhibition, Evelyn Lawson organized a reunion for members of the 1915-16 board. Then, in their 60s and 70s, the women recalled with pride their contribution to the community. They had paved the way for a younger generation of women to take up leadership roles in civic affairs, and they had encouraged visitors to appreciate San Diego's forward-thinking attitudes towards modern life at the turn of the 20th century. Thank you. Thank you. Okay.